By the second ramp alarm, I had already counted 18 breaths, 2 clean and 2 even. The man on the stretcher lay under a gray blanket with his mouth open, his chest rising like he was following a metronome nobody else could hear. They were yelling flail chest over the whine of the hydraulics, over dock crew waving us forward, over the 3 warning blasts that meant the ramp was about to come up whether God approved or not. Bram stood at my left knee, still as a locked gate, nose angled toward the van instead of the patient. That got my attention faster than the shouting did. The van came up hot, tires hissing on wet steel, red light bar dead, but the grill still spattered with grit and salt. The man walking beside the stretcher had one hand on the rail and the other up in a flat little gesture people used when they expected the room to belong to them. It was Nolan Vey, with a clean jaw and eyes working way too hard. "Rib crush," he said. "He's decompensating." He wanted the words to do the lifting for him. I stepped in anyway, 2 fingers to the patient's neck, eyes on the chest wall. No paradoxical movement, no broken rhythm, no panic in the body. Just 18 steady breaths a minute, and the faint, sour edge of stress, sweat underneath all that bleach and rainwater. Not the patient's, but his. I caught the blanket, peeled it back just far enough to see the taped padding over the ribs, then let it fall. The man on the stretcher gave me a performance groan a beat late, like he was waiting for my cue. Bram's right ear twitched, scar flashing under the dock lights. He lifted his muzzle to about 45 degrees and froze there, not on the body, not on Nolan, but on the rear seam of the van. I heard phones coming up before I saw them. They made small, mechanical sounds and flashes. Passengers loved a scene, as long as it was happening to somebody else. "Close the ramp," I said. "If that van leaves, someone dies for real." That landed the way truth usually landed in public. First, a pocket of silence. Then, irritation. A woman under a plastic poncho muttered, "Jesus Christ." Somebody farther back said, "Are you kidding me?" Nolan gave me a wounded look that was probably effective on juries and idiots. "Medic, he needs treatment now. He needs a better script." I put my hand flat on the stretcher rail and felt the patient tense under the blanket. Real pain burned hot and ugly. This was control. This was waiting. The third blast rolled over us. Steel under my boots shivered. The whole ramp seemed to draw one long breath of its own. Colin Shaw came out of the noise like he'd been grown there. He wore a high-vis jacket half open, with a radio already in his hand and an expression sour in that practical way men got when the schedule was slipping in public. He looked at the stretcher, looked at me, then at the line of cars backed up behind the van. He cared about throughput first, faces later. "What's the hold?" "Fake emergency," I said. "He's breathing 18, no flail movement, and my dog's telling me the van matters more than the patient." A couple people laughed at that. It was the wrong kind of laugh, a cheap one. Colin didn't. He just looked at Bram, then at the phones pointed our way, then at the clock over the ramp controls. "Do you have proof?" "I have enough to stop this for 90 seconds. "What you have," he said, clipped and tired, "is a recommendation." That one stung because it was true. I was contract medical. I could call for a hold. I could not own one. Nolan stayed quiet. That was smart, letting the system punch me for him. Colin thumbed his radio. "Ramp control, continue lift, medical transfer boards, no delay." The hydraulic lifts engaged with a loud grind. Somewhere behind me, somebody cheered like this was customer service finally winning. Bram pressed one step closer to my leg, not seeking comfort, just aligning for work. I adjusted the med pouch at my hip out of habit, making space where space didn't exist anymore. I moved with the stretcher because there was nothing else to do that wasn't theater. The wheels rattled over the seam and onto the ferry deck. Rain blew in one last sheet before the ramp started climbing. Nolan kept beside the rail, polite as a church usher, but now I saw what he couldn't quite hide. He never looked down at the man he claimed was crashing. He watched doors, angles, crew movement, distances, and the useful things. Inside the vehicle deck, the air changed fast, carrying scents of diesel, hot metal, old salt, and fryer grease drifting down from passenger level, all of it trapped under the belly of the ship. The man on the stretcher let out another measured moan. I leaned close enough to smell his skin. He was drugged, maybe, and coached, definitely. Bram's nose cut once toward the van again, then toward Nolan's sleeve, displaying a split attention. That bothered me more than the lie itself. Behind us, the ramp rose with that hydraulic whine, steel dragging up into steel until the outside world narrowed to a wet gray stripe and vanished. Colin's voice came over the interior speaker a moment later. All business, no apology, announcing departure procedures to a boat full of people who had watched me lose. The ferry shuddered under my boots as the screws bit water. I looked at Nolan. He smiled without showing teeth. Whatever he had brought aboard, it was locked in with us now. The sickbay smelled like iodine, bleach, damp canvas, and the cheap coffee somebody had burned hours ago and never admitted to. Underneath it all, under the disinfectant and the ferry's engine thrum coming up through the deck, I could still catch that sour animal tang of stress sweat every time Nolan Vey moved. It wasn't fear exactly, more like effort, keeping lies upright. The patient lay on my cot with the blanket tucked under his arms now, skin pale in the fluorescent light, breathing the same steady 18 a minute he'd been giving me on the ramp. He was too neat and too obedient. A body in trouble never read like that. I shut the door behind us and turned the latch. It was a small room with a narrow sink and cabinets that never closed right. Bram stationed himself beside the rear corner of the cot, silent, scarred ear angled back, eyes moving between the patient and Nolan. I set my trauma kit on the counter and lined up shears, stethoscope, and penlight. It was all habit and rhythm. My pulse had settled by then. Embarrassment burned hot for 10 seconds. After that, it either ate you or it became fuel. I preferred fuel. Blanket off, I said. Nolan didn't move. He needs oxygen. He needs honesty. Oxygen can wait half a second. I peeled the blanket down myself. The rib wrap was sloppy up close. All theater and no urgency. Padding taped where a scared amateur thought bad injuries ought to live. I watched the chest rise and fall. No hitch, no collapse, no weird seesaw motion under the sternum. I laid my fingertips along the lower ribs and felt muscle tighten before I even pressed. It was anticipation, not pain. The patient gave me another moan, softer this time. That made one of us. You said he vomited in the van, I told Nolan. He did. I leaned in, close enough to smell the man's mouth. Nothing there but stale antacid and dry tongue. No acid burn. No sour spray on the blanket. I straightened and looked down at Nolan's boots. Then at the patient's. They were bone dry, too clean for the weather outside. Rain had been hammering the dock hard enough to silver the steel. If he'd vomited 10 minutes ago, your boots would smell different. He smiled a little, but it came late. His eyes scanned the cabinets, the vent, the exit sign, and measured the distance from my counter to the door. He stood off the line of the cot too, angled toward the hall instead of the man he claimed was crashing. Escorts who cared about patients leaned in. Escorts who cared about routes kept their hips pointed somewhere else. Bram lifted his nose, licked once at the iodine-thick air, then locked up again so hard he looked carved out of dark wood. The ferry rolled under us, just enough to make the hanging IV pole whisper against the wall. I put the stethoscope on the patient's chest anyway, because ritual mattered. His lungs were clear, and his heart was quick, but not desperate. He was drugged, maybe, and coached, definitely. I took a penlight to his pupils. He flinched before the beam hit. Wrong again. A soft knock hit the door and then opened before I answered. Tamzin Reed slipped in sideways, one hand still on the frame, the other worrying her ring finger. She wore a purser uniform, half damp from the boarding lane, and she had sharp eyes and a sharp memory. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry. "The deck office wants a passenger count update, and your miracle case has a problem." Nolan looked at her like she was furniture. Tamzin looked at me. "The shoes. His and yours." She nodded toward the patient, then Nolan. They were bone dry. We pulled 2 families in after them, and they were dripping on the deck. These 2 weren't. Nobody said anything for a beat. Engine noise filled it, a low pounding from somewhere deep below us. Tamzin bent her ring finger once, twice, then let her hand fall. "Thanks," I said. Nolan shifted back a step, his wet coat whispering against itself. I looked at the hand, then at him. That's the part where smart men stop making this worse. He gave me the same polite face he'd used on the ramp. It was cracking now. "You're reading too much into a transfer." "No," I said. "I'm finally reading the right thing." The patient turned his head toward Nolan, without meaning to. Tiny move. Reflex. Confirmation. It was the clean boots, the fake rib wrap, and the breathing so regular, it felt rehearsed. Nolan watching exits instead of the cot. Bram flagging the van, not the body. This wasn't a sick man creating a problem. This was a problem wearing a sick man over it, like a coat. Tamzin didn't leave. Good for her. Bram's lips parted just enough to show the edge of a canine. No sound, only pressure building in the room. I took 1 slow step sideways, putting the counter at my hip and the sharps tray out of easy reach for anybody but me. There was no drama and no speech, just geometry. Nolan's eyes dropped to my hands, then to Bram, then back to the door. His fingers touched the inside of his coat like he was checking that something was still there. That was when I knew the patient was never the point. And whatever the point was, it had already moved somewhere else on my ferry. Nolan didn't push back after that. That was smart. Men like him only argued when it bought them something. He gave me a clipped little nod, glanced at the fake patient, then said he was going to get the insurance paperwork from the van. He claimed he needed insurance paperwork after midnight on a ferry already out of the slip, which I didn't believe. His eyes told the truth before the words were done, as he checked the door, the hall, Bram, me, and then the door again. He wasn't worried about the man on my cot. He was checking lanes. "Stay with him," I told Tamzin. She stopped worrying her ring finger long enough to watch Nolan go. "That's not where he's going." "No," I said. "It isn't." I slid 2 fingers under Bram's collar, quick and low, warm fur against my knuckles. Small ritual, release, not comfort. He shifted without looking up. Scarred ear twitched once. I let Nolan have a few seconds, then eased out into the corridor behind him and pulled the sickbay door in until the latch kissed home. The hall was washed in that ugly yellow fairy light that made everyone look sick or guilty, usually both. Under my boots, the deck throbbed with open water vibration. "He's not crashing," I murmured. "He's performing." Nolan walked like he belonged there. He walked not fast and not slow, with no wasted glance and no hesitation at the intersections. He passed the turn for passenger services without even pretending to consider it. That mattered. Men making it up as they went always leaked uncertainty through their feet. This one didn't. I stayed back far enough to keep out of the edge of his vision and close enough to hear his soles click over the steel seams. Bram moved beside my knee with his head low, sorting air from deck wash, then back to air again. The corridor pinched down near a restricted access point. We passed a fire hose cabinet, safety placards, and a watertight door with a card reader and scrape marks around the latch from years of hard use. Nolan stopped there, dipped a hand inside his coat, and pulled out a key card he had no business carrying. He swiped once. The reader gave a long, flat electronic tone instead of the quick, clean tone crew got when a pass matched the door. It hung there maybe 1.2 seconds before the latch kicked loose with a heavy metallic sound that traveled straight into my teeth. He slipped through. I caught the door before the seal took, palm against cold steel, and listened. I heard footsteps below that were measured and not running. He still thought he was ahead. That told me almost as much as the card did. By then, the pieces had started acting like one machine. I thought about the fake flailed chest, the clean boots, the dry blanket, Nolan watching exits instead of his patient, and Bram flagging the van harder than the body. Nobody spent money, timing, and nerve like that just to scare a contractor or knife somebody in a hall. If they wanted a dead man, they could have used the dockside, a parking lot, or a motel room. Out here, on a packed ferry with departure cameras and 100 witnesses, the stunt only made sense if the patient was never the point. No, this was retrieval. It had to be a small target, portable, something worth staging a moving distraction for. Not some cartoon bioweapon or launch codes, but something ugly in a quieter way. Route data, old sonar imagery, access intel for a private inlet or working harbor. The kind of thing a contractor could carry aboard in a hard, waterproof drive and never look important until the wrong crew built a job around it. Mid-transit made sense too. Onshore, people got matched to manifests and cameras. Out here, the ship itself became cover. The ferry rolled and something below banged twice in a cabinet. Bram tracked low over the threshold, caught Nolan's stressed sweat, and leaned into it with purpose. Fresh enough, thin line, real. The service passage swallowed the nicer parts of the ship in a hurry. No soft yellow glow down there, just caged fixtures bolted overhead, washing pipes, cable runs, and sweating steel in a pale dead light. The air turned colder and filthier at the same time, carrying metal, bilge damp, diesel, and old heat trapped inside machinery. My boots rang on the deck, so I shortened my stride and placed each step where the sound died faster. Bram moved a half length ahead, shoulder blades rolling under his harness, clip ticking softly at his collar. Somewhere deeper in, a heavy door shut hard enough to throw the echo back along the passage. Not Nolan's pace now. Somebody else or another route waking up. Good news, bad news, same family. Bram stopped so fast, the line went tight between us. The lowest sound he'd made all night leaked out through his teeth, not a bark, barely a growl. He was staring past a junction box toward a black utility run, dropping between two pipe banks into lower dark, nose pinned to it, body locked so hard he looked bolted in place. That was the moment the job stopped pretending to be medicine and turned into a hunt. Bram lost the line 3 minutes later, and it wasn't on him. The service passage opened into a crossing zone near the vehicle deck where the ship's lungs lived. Big industrial fans dragging air through steel hard enough to bend every smell in the place. Diesel rolled in low and greasy. It was hot, bitter, and mean enough to sting the back of my throat. Bram sneezed once, then again, nose snapping right with sudden conviction. He pulled that way, claws scraping on paint-slick steel. I followed 2 steps before the lie in the air caught up with me. Not source, wash. The fans were hauling everything sideways. Easy, I muttered. He checked, circled, sneezed again, then froze with his head tilted like the whole deck had insulted him personally. He was a good dog dealing with bad air. It put us off maybe 3 yards, which out in the world wasn't much, and down there was enough to hand somebody a knife and a surprise. The crossing smelled like wet rags, hot wiring, and old rust. Somewhere close by, water tapped metal in a patient little drip. A parked medical cart sat half-tucked beside a steel door, narrow frame, locking wheels, heavy enough to matter. Bram corrected left. That was when the dark behind me moved. An arm hooked across my throat and tried to drag me backward into the blind space between the fan housing and the bulkhead. There was no warning and no movie grunt, just pressure and stale gum breath in my ear. I tucked my chin, dropped my weight, and took the hit ugly. Better ugly than clean in tight quarters. My shoulder cracked off steel. White sparks burst across my vision. Bram hit the end of his line and lunged for the wrong body first, half blinded by the diesel wash. The man behind me had enough strength to make things bad and just enough confidence to make a mistake. I got one hand on the parked cart and ripped it sideways, hauling it between us to break the chokehold. The wheels scraped loudly. Metal slammed through the passage. He tried to reset his grip, but he needed room, and I'd just taken it. I drove the cart backward, into the space he was standing in. The frame caught his thigh and folded him backward into the watertight door, with a loud impact that rang down the corridor like dropped tools, forcing a sharp, breathless curse out of him. Air came back when his arm loosened. I shoved forward, shoulder first, and pinned him where the cart, the door, and the wall narrowed to almost nothing. Cramped geometry did the work for me. His elbow had nowhere useful to go. His boot slipped. My forearm stayed under his jaw, just enough to keep his head from turning clean. Bram found the right scent a beat later and came in hot, teeth bare, not biting, just owning the only lane the man had left. Overhead, the fan roared and moved everybody's lies around for free. He was younger than Nolan, thicker through the neck. He wore a work jacket with no company patch and a dock hoodie underneath, marking him as a decoy. Not because he looked cheap, but because he kept trying to glance past me instead of through me. Men who wanted to win a fight watched the fight. Men buying time watched the route behind it. "Why are you watching me instead of him?" I said. That landed. His eyes flicked once toward the deeper passage Nolan had taken. Reflex. Thank you. He tried to drive a knee up into me. The cart ate most of it. I stamped the brake down and the wheel locked hard. He was stuck then, breath hot and rough against my sleeve. Bram's growl rattled in the metal air. I checked his coat pockets, his waistband, and his back pocket. I found an access card and a folding knife, but no hard case, no waterproof drive, nothing with the right weight. Damn it. He smiled with one bruised corner of his mouth where the door had clipped him. He wasn't brave, just pleased enough to be irritating. Somewhere deeper in the service level, a bulkhead slammed, or somebody made it sound that way. Hard to tell with the fans chewing the echo to pieces. Where is he? He didn't answer. Didn't have to. The missing drive answered for him. This had never been one man running a cover story. It was a relay team. I dumped him down hard, shoved him flat along the base of the door, then wrapped the cart across him so he'd need time and help to get loose. My pulse was up. Bram's too. You could see it ticking through his ribs. He was still working, but the picture had gone dirty. Diesel wash had chewed holes through the scent line, and now more than one man lived inside it. Nolan was ahead, the decoy was behind, and there was maybe another body in the maze. Or maybe not. That uncertainty was the tax now. Bram moved 3 paces into the crossing and stopped, head snapping between 2 roots. One carried fresher sweat. The other held a trace of bleach from the van and something metallic under it, cold and dry, like sealed hardware. He sneezed again, frustrated, then looked back at me for the first time since the grab. He wasn't asking, he was reporting. "Yeah," I said. "I know." The ferry rolled harder, shadows shifting with it. Somewhere below us, a chain clanged once and went still. I looked at the pinned decoy, then at the 2 bad options ahead. Nolan had help. Bram wasn't wrong, just no longer perfect. That was worse in some ways. Then a shoe scraped steel in the darker passage to the left. Bram launched toward it. The scream came sharp and short, then cut off on a heavy impact against metal that made my teeth hurt. Bram snapped toward it before I did. We hit the passenger corridor in time to see a young woman on the deck beside a watertight doorway, half curled around one leg, tote bag spilled open, palms clamped over her knee. The ferry rolled under us. Her body rolled with it. The raised steel combing had caught her clean. You could see that much without kneeling. She was in her early 20s. Wet hair stuck to her mouth. Her leg was injured badly on first look. The joint canted where it shouldn't be. Blood pushed through her fingers in fast bursts and ran into the grooves in the paint. Not the kind of wound you ignored if you wanted to sleep later. Nolan had gone deeper. Bram knew it. I knew it. The dog leaned hard toward the dark passage, then checked back to me, furious already. My watch said time was leaving faster than we were. I dropped to one knee and pulled gloves on. "Look at me," I said. She tried, eyes blown wide, with shock and the effort of staying quiet. "I can't feel right," she said. "You can feel enough to answer. Name." "April." That was good, because a name kept people from floating away on you. I got her hands off the wound one at a time and replaced panic with pressure. Her blood hit the gloves, hot and slick. The engine noise lived under the deck, a deep, steady pounding that made everything feel a half-second late. Bram paced 2 tight steps, sneezed diesel out of his nose, then posted at my shoulder when I told him to hold. He kept staring toward Nolan's route as if disapproval alone might move me. April tried to sit up. I pushed her flat again. "Don't help. Help is staying still." She swallowed a cry and bit it off. She was a good girl with no melodrama, just pain doing what pain did. I tightened the wrap enough to slow the bleed and felt the leg jump under my hands. Joint damage, severe enough to matter. This was temporary work only, nothing miraculous, just keeping a bad thing from getting worse before a real team arrived. The smell in that corridor was diesel, hot steel, wet nylon, and fresh blood. My count came in by itself. Her breaths, mine, the beat of the engines. Keep the rhythm, and maybe you kept the person. She stared past me toward the service level and said, "A guy ran through here. Blue EMT jacket, I think." My hands didn't stop. "When?" "Just now," he clipped me. Didn't even look back. I braced the leg with what I had and kept pressure where it counted. April's fingers dug into my sleeve hard enough to wrinkle the fabric. "He went down," she said, "toward the trucks. Lower ramp side. Did you see a number?" She shut her eyes, trying to find it through the pain. The ferry rolled again. Somewhere down the hall, a speaker coughed static and died. 3, she whispered, then louder, because she knew it mattered. A big painted 3 on the wall. Vehicle deck, I think. He went that way. Vehicle deck 3. It was clean enough to use. Better than a guess, and better than a theory. Nolan wasn't wandering blind. He had a lane, and now I had it too. The chase changed shape right there. No more sniffing through every rat hole in the ship. I needed route control to cut the exits, choke the deck, and make the ferry choose sides. But that was for later. April grabbed my sleeve again. She had a small hand that was trembling hard. "Don't leave." There was the trap. The real one. Nolan got farther awasi if I stayed. She bled more if I went. Nobody ever clapped for that choice. They just waited to see which guilt you picked. "I'm not leaving," I said. And once it was said, it cost what it cost. I used a clipped voice. No drama. I keyed the radio with my clean wrist and called for a stretcher team, passenger medical support, and blood control supplies to the passenger corridor outside the lower service crossing. Colin came back through static wanting location and injury class. I gave him both and nothing else. If I started selling him Nolan over open comms, he'd ask for proof and choose seconds I no longer owned. April's breathing started to thin out around the edges, shock creeping in. I kept her talking just enough to pin her to the moment. I asked about her hometown, whether she could feel her toes, and whether she'd blacked out. She could feel them, which was better than good. Crew boots finally hammered down the corridor, too slow for my taste, fast enough to save the leg if they didn't get stupid. Bram huffed through his nose and looked at me like I'd personally designed suffering. Maybe fair. When the stretcher team rounded the corner, I handed April off in 3 hard sentences and made them repeat Vehicle Deck 3 back to me, just to hear it said aloud. Then I stripped the gloves, blood tacky at the wrists, and stood too fast. The deck shifted under me. Nolan had 10 minutes on me, maybe less, maybe more. Didn't matter. He had distance. I had coordinates. That was enough to start hunting smart. I hit the radio on the run. Chief Engineer, this is medical. On lower passenger side. I need ventilation override at Vehicle 3 and a zone isolation check now. My voice came back off the steel, thin and ugly. Bram ran at my knee, still sorting bad air from real air. Ahead, the passage widened toward the truck lanes. Nolan had distance. Distance only mattered while the ship stayed open. Static, cracked. Then a man's voice, rough with age and irritation, came through the radio mesh. Medical, say again and say it like you know what you're asking for. It was Hugh Calder, which was good, because Hugh never confused manners with urgency. I took the steps 2 at a time. Unknown male in restricted movement pattern below passenger level. Unauthorized access through service zones feeding Vehicle Deck 3. Possible interference with controlled equipment or contractor cargo. I need airflow reversed and bulkhead control ready. You got eyes on damage? Not yet. I've got eyes on intent. Intent isn't damage. It is if you wait long enough. The vehicle approach opened around us in steel lanes and trailer shadows. All diesel, salt, hot brake dust, and rubber. Bram swung left, corrected, then drove forward again with that irritated little huff he gave when a scent line kept moving under him. Nolan was close, or had been. The route was tightening. I keyed the radio again, hearing the static spit around my own words. Listen carefully. Subject used restricted card access below deck. I already pinned 1 decoy in the service passage. This is a team job. If he reaches contractor vehicles or engineering access on 3, this becomes a reportable systems problem. That did it. Not because Hugh believed me, because he believed machinery, and machinery hated surprises. His answer came back under a clang of tools and radio hiss. God damn it. Seal Deck 3. A second channel opened, with Colin on it, crisp and public through the speaker grid. Medical, state exact hazard. Unauthorized male, moving toward Vehicle Deck. 3 through restricted lanes. Potential interference with equipment and controlled access points. Lock civilian movement above and close soft routes. There was no apology for the ramp, and none was requested. This wasn't about being right anymore. It was about turning the ferry into a trap before Nolan reached whatever he'd boarded to take. The first change came through the air. Bram felt it before I did. His head came up, nose twitching hard, then swinging as the ventilation flow shifted somewhere beyond the bulkheads. A deep metallic shudder rolled through the deck under my boots. The interior speakers chirped once, and the ship's background hum changed pitch. Attention, crew and passengers. Colin said over the PA, his voice flattened by the system. Restricted access adjustment in progress. Hold current positions and await crew direction. Good. Enough truth to freeze the soft traffic. Ahead of me, a light over a watertight door flipped from green to amber. 1 second later, the hydraulic pistons bit. A half-open door down lane slammed shut with a hard metallic hammer blow that kicked a tremor through the floor. Another answered farther off, then another. The PA kept talking in one ear, while steel kept slamming in the other. Radio chatter and bulkhead impact fighting for the same air. The closures moved in sequence, sealing lanes and cutting the deck into compartments. Nolan had just lost the luxury of options. Bram lunged toward the noise, checked, then drove for the narrow portside passage still left open. Bad air or not, he understood funnels. I cut between parked trailers, ducking mirror arms and tie-down chains. Somewhere ahead, boots hit steel at a run and then stopped. Nolan had heard the closures too. Good. Hugh came back on the radio, breathing a little harder now, the static cracking under each word. Vent 3 is reversed. Bulkhead cycle is live. If your boy's down there, he's losing his clean path. Keep taking it away. No warmth, no loyalty. Just a man protecting his ship from somebody else's mess. Another alarm sounded, lower this time, and the light state shifted again, amber washing toward red. The whole deck looked meaner under it, stripped down to warning paint and moving shadow. I rounded the flank of a refrigerated trailer and caught a flash of blue EMT fabric at the far end of the lane, disappearing through the last open gap before another watertight door finished closing. Nolan. He looked back once, saw me, then saw the door behind me, sealing shut, and understood exactly what had happened. His jaw tightened as the reality set in. The ferry had stopped being neutral. He cut right instead of left. Had to. The left lane was dead now, hard sealed by steel and hydraulics. Hugh had fouled the easy scent picture, but he'd also done something better. He'd made every remaining path legible. Forced turns, blind corners, choke points, no soft exits left. Bram barked once. First time all night. Short, furious. Then he drove toward the only route Nolan had left. Nails ticking over steel. I followed, lungs burning, radio slapping my shoulder, while behind us, the last sequence of pistons slammed home in a chain reaction that shook the whole deck. Red warning light strobed across trailer flanks, steel pillars, Bram's back, my hands. Somewhere above, the PA repeated Colin's instruction in the same flat tone, as if the ship shutting itself around a moving target was just another line item on a crossing schedule. Systems didn't grow souls because you suffered inside them. They just kept doing what they were built to do. Tonight that finally worked for me. Nolan Vey was no longer running loose through a ferry. The deck lanes were sealed behind him, the passenger side was dead to him, and the air itself had turned against the clean trail he wanted. Bram drove for the narrow stair access ahead, body low, intent hard as iron. Stairwell 4 was where the ship was sending him now. I got there first. That mattered. I was on the top landing with Bram tight beside my left leg and the broken cafeteria tray in my hand. Thin aluminum with one bent corner and a crack running almost through the middle. Below us, one flight down in the strobing red light, Nolan Vey came up hard through the oily stairwell, with one hand on the rail and one shoulder dipped. The treads under him were black, with old machine oil and rainwater tracked in from somewhere higher. He'd lost the polite act somewhere between deck 3 and the stairs. That was good, because I trusted ugly more than charm. Nolan looked at the dog, then at me, then at the steep run of steps between us. He knew what I knew. There was no room to build speed and no room to swing wide. Every bad choice got smaller in a stairwell. The ferry rolled, just enough to make the handrail creak. Diesel and hot metal sat in the back of my throat. Somewhere above us, a bulkhead door slammed, and the sound ran down the shaft like a warning delivered through bone. "Don't," I said. He smiled once. Tired smile. Professional. Then he came up anyway. The first hit wasn't a punch so much as a collision with intent behind it. Nolan drove low from the steps below, shoulder into my chest, trying to fold me backward over Bram and take the landing in one ugly rush. I caught the rail with my left hand and let the stairwell do some of the work for me. There was no space for clean technique and no hero nonsense, just weight, angle, and impact. Bram lunged inside Nolan's step and forced him half sideways. Enough. Nolan's boot slipped on the oily edge of a tread, and his hip smacked steel hard enough to bark sound out of him. I rammed the tray down into his forearm. The aluminum struck hard. His grip broke for a second. I gritted my teeth against the flare of pain in my shoulder. That second mattered. He shoved Bram off with a knee, came up with his back to the wall, and grabbed for my wrist. I gave him the wrist and took his balance. We hit the railing together. My bad shoulder lit up white and mean. His breath hit my face, sour and hot, and I could feel how controlled he still was. That annoyed me. Men in pain should have the decency to look like it. He brought his elbow up in the cramped little way stairwells forced on you. I ducked most of it. The rest split the skin near my temple and made the light jump. Panic later, I said, breathless. Breathe now. Falling down these stairs is paperwork. He tried to laugh and got a grunt instead. Bram came again, not biting, just filling space and killing Nolan's next step on the narrow stair below us. That was enough for me to get the tray around like a club, with nowhere elegant to go. I didn't swing high. No room. I drove the broken edge straight into Nolan's right knee from the side and kept driving until the metal buckled and his leg folded with it. The sound wasn't cinematic, just a heavy physical impact buried under the steel thunder of all three of us hitting the stairs at once. Nolan dropped one step, caught himself, then lost something out of his coat. I saw it before I understood it. A hard black rectangle, waterproof case, thick as a hand, and wrong in exactly the way I'd expected wrong to look all night. The black waterproof drive hit a steel tread between us, bounced off the nosing, spun once in the strobing red light, and skipped down into the lower stairwell. It struck off one step, then another, ricocheted off the inside rail post, and vanished below the next landing, with a sound like a tool tossed into a shaft. Everybody saw it. Nolan let out one raw breath and threw himself after it. I caught jacket instead of skin, got a fistful of blue fabric, and fabric tore. Bram slammed his chest into Nolan's thigh and turned the angle again, but the drive was already gone, clacking down the steps and disappearing into the lower dark, one hard metallic strike at a time. Nolan twisted, kicked free of the ruined jacket, and for one ugly second, all three of us were no longer fighting for the stairwell. We were fighting for whatever had just fallen through it. I planted one boot on the top landing and one on the first step below, blocking the choke point with my body, while Bram held the center line beside me and Nolan crouched on the steps under us, weight off his bad knee now, face gone flat with pain and calculation. Blood ran warm into my eyebrow. Oil made the steel shine under all three of us. The drive clicked once somewhere lower down, then went still. No one moved. Then Nolan looked past Bram into the dark below, and I knew the next part was going to cost me something worse than blood. Everything in me wanted to go red and stupid. I didn't. I couldn't. Nolan had been waiting for Bram to commit. That was the difference between a good dog and a perfect one. Good still had to move through the world. Nolan pivoted on the bad leg, found one ugly angle, and drove the sole of his boot out short and vicious. Bram took it in the ribs and side of the shoulder. The sound he made hitting steel was worse than a yelp, because it wasn't one, just a heavy impact of living weight against a painted bulkhead. His harness hardware rattled once. Then he dropped hard on the upper landing and tried to rise on a front leg that folded wrong under him. Nolan knew better than to admire the work. He went past the hurt, limping now, dragging his right leg a fraction down the steps toward where the drive had gone dark below us. I went to Bram first, because that was the rule, and because rules were all that kept nights like this from turning into revenge. He was breathing fast, silent, eyes bright and furious, one front leg hanging wrong. I slid 2 fingers under his collar, then along the vest strap to the rough black buckle, felt the hammering pulse under fur and skin. There would be no miracle, no reset, no movie bullshit. We'd lost the best sensor in the room. Guard, I said, with the hand signal low and close. He held my eyes once, swallowed the pain, and shifted his weight back onto the other 3 legs. Below us, Nolan's shoes scraped another step. I moved down after him with the broken tray handle still in my fist. The full tray was gone now, torn down to a jagged strip of aluminum, with one sharp bend in it. More noisemaker than weapon. Good enough. The stairwell narrowed after the first landing, and the air changed with it. There was less diesel and more cold iron, bilge damp, and stale machinery heat trapped in old paint. Red emergency light strobed down the center and left the corners black. Nolan was 3 steps below, one hand dragging along the rail, one shoulder angled toward the dark where the drive had fallen. He was limping, but not enough to save me from him. Bram stayed above, exactly where I'd put him, chest heaving, one paw lifted clear of the deck. He was not chasing and not tracking, just holding. That hurt more than the blood in my eye. We'd worked too many years together for me not to feel the absence, when he stopped being the point of the spear. The silence behind me changed shape. Usually his breath, his weight shifts, the small click of harness hardware told me where the danger bent. Now all I had was memory and the ship. Nolan glanced back and saw the dog wasn't coming, saw me understand it. That gave him confidence. Bad for him. He pushed off the rail and came at me in the cramped, ugly way people fought in stairwells. Short elbows, boots, shoulders, no wasted reach. The broken handle in my hand met his forearm with a dry metallic smack and jumped out of my grip. Fine. Bare hands then. He caught my jacket, slammed me into the wall, and drove pain across my ribs in a bright line. I answered with my forehead under his chin. It was not pretty, but it was effective enough. His teeth clicked shut. We slid a step lower together, boots skidding on oil and old grit. Something hard hit the stair below us and spun. The drive. Close. Not close enough. I saw it tucked against the inside edge of the lower landing, half in shadow, one strip of casing catching the red pulse from above. Nolan saw it too. That was the problem with small, valuable objects. Everybody could love them at once. He broke from me first, because he had to. Reached. I caught the back of his coat and dragged him half around. He answered with another kick, but the bad knee stole power from it. It still clipped my thigh and made the leg numb for a second. Good. I only needed one bad second to remember I was alive. We crashed into the rail again, both of us breathing hard now, neither with enough room to finish the other cleanly. Behind me, Bram's harness buckle gave one thin click as he rebalanced on 3 legs. I felt that in my chest. I risked a glance back, just long enough to see him planted where I'd left him on the upper landing, body rigid, injured leg hanging, useless, teeth bared at the empty upper run of stairs in case more company came. He was a good-working dog, with no whining and no pleading, just pain and duty sharing the same body. I put my hand back on the broken strip of tray metal and picked it up from the step. Nolan's face had changed. Less charm, more exhaustion. Real now. His right knee trembled every time the ferry rolled. Mine probably did too. The drive sat below us on the lower landing, waiting for whichever idiot earned it. I could still feel Bram's pulse under my fingers from a minute ago. Fast. Too fast. We lost the best radar we had, I said, mostly to myself. Nolan frowned like he hadn't heard me right. Good. Let him wonder. Then I stepped down into the lower dark alone, tray metal in my hand, Bram guarding the stair behind me, and Nolan Vey between me and the drive. The weather deck hit like a slap with salt in it. Wind came sideways, mean and cold enough to make my eyes water before the rain even found me. The sea was black except where it broke white along the ferry's wake, and the deck lights turned every wet surface into a bad decision. Nolan was 15 feet ahead, limping hard toward the open stretch near the aft rail, one arm tight against his side, the other holding the drive like he hadn't decided yet whether to keep it, break it, or throw it into the Atlantic and let everybody lose. His bad knee dragged on the downbeat of every step. The ferry rolled, and he caught the rail to stay upright. There were no passengers. Good work from Tamzin. No soft bodies wandering into the wrong kind of ending. Just wind, water, steel, and one man finally stripped down to what he was without the EMT jacket and the smooth talk. I pushed the heavy door shut behind me with my shoulder and heard the latch take. Nolan glanced back at the sound, saw the distance between us, and gave me a smile that was all pain and calculation. "You're late," he said. "Still ahead of your limp," I said, and kept moving. The deck narrowed, where the outer rail ran past a line of tied-down equipment lockers and a low-maintenance crane. There was nothing fancy, just enough fixed metal to turn movement into geometry, if you knew how to read it. Nolan tried to angle left toward the shadow behind the crane housing, maybe looking for cover, maybe looking for a cleaner throw into the water. The wind killed that idea. It hit him broadside and made the bad leg wobble under him. He corrected too hard, caught himself on the rail again, and for 1 second the drive hung loose in his hand. I didn't rush him. Rush made noise. Rush made mistakes. I let the sea and the steel do a little of the work. The deck pitched. Rain sheeted across the paint. Nolan took one more dragging step and stopped because there wasn't a good next one. Rail on one side, locker bank on the other. Open black water beyond both if he slipped wrong. His breath came white and ragged in the light. "You don't get to keep that," I said. He looked at the drive, then at the water. Maybe neither of us does. That was the first honest thing he'd said to me all night. He cocked his arm like he might throw it. I shifted half a step, enough to show him I'd go through him before I let him wind up clean. He saw it. Good. Men who wanted options hated being seen clearly. The ferry climbed a swell and dropped off it hard. Nolan's right leg buckled at the landing, and he hit the rail with his hip, teeth flashing in a hiss. The drive slipped lower in his grip. I closed the last 6 feet then. Not fast, just committed. He swung the drive at my head instead of throwing it. That was smart to keep the asset in play. I got my forearm up, took the hit on bone, and felt the shock run all the way to my shoulder. Then I drove into him before he could reset. We slammed into the locker bank. Metal boomed under us. His bad knee folded when I put my weight on that side and kept it there. It wasn't a trick, just pressure and physics. He tried to turn out and found nothing but wet deck and empty air beyond the rail. I caught his jacket with one hand and the wrist holding the drive with the other. He fought to pry loose enough room to throw or break it. Didn't have the leg for it. Didn't have the footing either. The wind howled over the deck, tearing his breath away. Mine too. Rain ran into my mouth and tasted like rust. "Let go," he said. "Then stop letting him win arguments." The words came out flat, almost bored, which was probably rude under the circumstances. He didn't appreciate them. He jerked hard, lost the rail, and had to choose between the drive and staying on his feet. Human bodies were selfish when they got close to water at night. He grabbed the rail. The drive dropped. It hit the deck once, skidded under the lip of the locker base, and stopped against my boot. Nolan looked at it, looked at the black water beyond the rail, then looked back at me. He was done. He wasn't surrendered, just finished, and there is a difference. I bent, picked the drive up, and backed out 1 step, keeping him boxed between the rail and his own ruined options. He held the metal upright with both hands now, shoulders heaving, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. No confession. No dramatic last line about bigger men and bigger plans. He knew better, and so did I. The deck light buzzed overhead. The ocean kept smashing itself against the hull like none of this mattered. Somewhere inside the ship, an alarm changed tone and then cut off. Nolan's face had gone pale around the mouth. It was pain, cold, blood loss, or maybe all three. If he made another move, it would be a stupid one. He seemed tired enough to know it. I wrapped my fingers tighter around the drive and let the silence sit between us. The Atlantic had already made its argument. I'd just closed the file. By 2:30, the ship had gone back to pretending it was just a ship again. The engines were steady, the lights were steady, and the doors were doing what doors did. The deck office made that lie easy. The room had bright fluorescent tubes, white panels, and glass over the timetable board, with everything scrubbed so clean it felt insulting. I sat on the deck with my back against a storage cabinet. Bram stretched along my left side with his head flat between his paws and one front leg in my lap. He was awake, watching the room without lifting his head, chest rising too fast, but quieter now. I had the bandage wrap threaded under his pastern, and around twice already. My fingers were stiff from cold and dried salt. Across the room, Colin Shaw stood at the counter with the logbook open beneath the harsh light. He didn't look at me while he wrote. Men like him had a way of making paperwork feel personal without ever changing expression. Every few seconds, he tapped one finger against the glass clock face mounted beside the schedule board. He was counting minutes, delays, reports, and passenger complaints still warming up in inboxes. Bram shifted when I tightened the wrap. Didn't whine. Just looked at me once and then away. "Hold still," I said. He ignored the instruction with dignity. Fair enough. The recovered drive sat on the desk in a clear evidence bag with a paper tag looped through the seal. Ugly little brick, waterproof. Ordinary looking enough to start all this, which felt about right. A second form had already printed from the terminal beside it, curling warm into the tray. An incident notification. Automatic forwarding block checked. Coast Guard distribution line live. Systems loved a trail almost as much as they loved a timetable. Colin signed one page, flipped it, signed the next. "The contractor has identified the item," he said. "He says if it had gone overboard, his employer would have sued everyone with a pulse." Comforting. He finally glanced over. He wasn't soft, and he wasn't hostile, just tired enough to stop editing himself. There was a scrape on his jaw I didn't remember seeing earlier. Maybe from the boarding lane. Maybe from rubbing his face through the part where the deck went sideways and stayed there. You filed a medical hold with no proof at the ramp. I filed a medical hold with the wrong kind of proof. That distinction won't help me much in the report. "No," I said. "Probably not." He tapped the clock again. A dry little tick against glass. Bram's ears twitched at the sound, then settled. "A report is filed," Colin said. "We are 45 minutes behind schedule, Holt." There it was. It was not gratitude or absolution, just the number with the weight attached to it. 45 minutes to him meant fuel burn, missed connections, irate supervisors, a captain explaining himself to people ashore who'd never smelled diesel in their lives. To me, it meant April still had her leg if orthopedics got lucky. Nolan was breathing in restraints instead of disappearing into the water. And Bram was alive, if pissed off about it. It was different math for the same night. I tucked the end of the wrap under with numb fingers and checked Bram's toes for warmth. They were still there with a good refill, though painful as hell probably. He licked once at my wrist and then put his chin back down like he regretted the display immediately. The room hummed with machine heat and fluorescent buzz. Somewhere out in the passage, crew boots went by in pairs, voices low, the tone people used after adrenaline had burned off and the paperwork phase had begun. On the desk, the red incident stamp lay beside the pad, inked and waiting. Colin picked it up, lined it over the corner of the top page, and brought it down with one hard, flat thump that sounded louder than any alarm had. That was the metal. Red ink, carbon copy, distribution list. I leaned back against the cabinet and felt every bruise I'd borrowed from the ship on the way here. My temple was split, my ribs were hot, and my thigh was stiffening. The kind of damage that looked minor until you tried sleeping with it. Bram's bandaged leg rested across my knee, heavier than usual, because now I knew exactly what it had cost him. There was no miracle reset, and no clean, heroic shot of the two of us walking out under sunrise. Just gauze, antiseptic, and tomorrow already lining up with a clipboard. Tomorrow meant a contract review, a statement to company medical oversight, and a follow-up on the use of force in a restricted area. It meant questions about why my dog was deployed on a passenger vessel in the first place. It meant questions about why I'd tried to hold a ramp without enough proof that could be understood by people who needed everything typed in nice, straight lines. Colin closed the logbook and squared it with the edge of the desk. "You'll be asked for a full narrative before docking." I figured. He nodded once. Business, not sympathy. Then he walked out with the evidence bag and the stamped report, leaving the fluorescent light to do what it did best, make fatigue look official. I sat there with Bram and listened to the ferry keep moving east through the dark, as if none of us had changed at all. That was the part people never liked hearing. You could do the right thing and still end the night owing everybody.